This episode is on resistance by slaves and the abolitionist movement. So, who were all the people resisting slavery? The slave is the first of the people that were resisting slavery, and resistance to slavery took many forms. You can see here on the right-hand side a slave who was beaten for his resistance to slavery. The scars on the back, obviously he's been flogged by somebody, and very few people would subject themselves to that and would probably do a lot of things to avoid such punishment. So what did slaves do to avoid that type of punishment? They could resist by slowing the pace of their work. They could resist too by stealing things from either the plant or the plantation broadly. They could sabotage farm instruments and or the crops themselves. They were less likely to do this because it was very difficult, but they could run away. And then we do have some few rebellions. These last two were very, very infrequent. In fact, runaway slaves constituted on a yearly basis, as we get close to 1860, only about 1,000 people. And we have exactly 3 rebellions in the early 19th century. So there were some even earlier, but there were 3 rebellions, or potential rebellions, plans, conspiracies to rebel in the 19th century. In 1800, we have Gabriel Prosser. He was a Virginia slave, and he planned a rebellion but was given away before anything was acted on, and he was captured and killed. We're not really sure if Denmark Vesey, who was in South Carolina, he was the son of a blacksmith and a slave, and he bought his freedom, and then he planned a rebellion and tried to get whites to join his rebellion. And this one is less certain. It may be more hearsay than we think, but nonetheless, Denmark Vesey is believed to have planned a rebellion. He too was captured and killed. And then last was Nat Turner. Nat Turner's distinguished because his rebellion actually took place. They killed Nat Turner, and his rebellion slaves killed nearly 60 people. They were ultimately put down, and he and over 100 other slaves were executed for this rebellion, and that took place in 1931. You want to note that date, 1931, is significant because the South will put restraints on any political discussion of slavery in the House of Congress. It's called the Gag Resolution, and we'll talk about that later. All right, so that's slaves and slave resistance as best they could. It's hard to cultivate resistance to slavery in any of the very active ways in the sense of running away or rebellion. It was more likely that you would resist the pace of work, try to sabotage your instruments, etc. In the North grew up an abolitionist movement, and this is not characteristic of the South. So the abolitionists are the ones that are really going to fight against slavery. Many of the early abolitionists came from the Quaker Christian religious sect. So Quakers were really adamantly against, and very egalitarian and adamantly against, the whole institution of slavery. There was a small but still significant Back to Africa movement, and it was run by a group called the American Colonization Society, and they were going to create a state, and they did, Liberia, in Africa, where blacks in America could go repatriate themselves in Africa. Very few actually did this, but in 1822 the African Colonization Society was successful in creating the state of Liberia. In the 1830s, the Second Great Awakening would inspire many to join the abolitionist movement as well, as we saw in an earlier chapter that the Second Great Awakening, part of the agenda, and often on the agenda, was resistance to slavery. I bring in Theodor Veld because this illustrates the academic world and their approach to slavery, or he's a young man who is in a seminary in the North, and all he wanted to do was have a debate over slavery, and the seminary forbid it, and they expelled him for even doing that. And he illustrates for us just the lack of action on the part of academic institutions. So Theodor Veld tried to do this. Again, he was in a seminary in Ohio, so in the North. So those are two institutions. Second Great Awakening, of course, inspires a broad commoners' resistance to slavery, and the university tended to be less active in the abolitionist movement. So the abolitionist movement was conducted by ordinary people, but it also had significant leadership. And here you can see Sojourner Truth on the top on the right, and then Frederick Douglass. And you guys are reading Frederick Douglass, the first 8 chapters of Frederick Douglass's autobiography called The Life and the Times, the narrative of the life and the times of Frederick Douglass. Other abolitionists are people like Garrison, and he was the publisher of a newspaper called The Liberator. And Henry Lloyd Garrison was unique, or was a leader in the abolitionist movement and a call for the immediate end to slavery. There were all sorts of opinions about how to end slavery. I think Abraham Lincoln at one time wanted to buy out the slaves in the South, so he was thinking the federal government could pay the Southerners to buy out slavery. But just to illustrate that there were other ideas about how to end slavery, and Henry Lloyd Garrison wanted to end it immediately, so he was one of the more radical, in other words, calling for a quick end to slavery. And his Liberator then was a newspaper that was a war of words, so a continual barrage in the North about how and why slavery should be ended. Also, our black abolitionists, as we said on the right here, Sojourner Truth, toured the United States and even Europe, talking about both the rights, or the end of slavery, and the rights of women. Frederick Douglass also toured the United States calling for the end of slavery, and then of course wrote books about slavery and why slavery should be ended, the most famous of which is his autobiography. So he was a big voice in the abolitionist movement. In 1833, we had the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So in the North, there was lots of pressure against the South to end slavery, and it was political pressure. The American Anti-Slavery Society had a big voice, a big pressure in the political world. And finally, we have another newspaper guy. This guy is in Ohio. Garrison was a Virginia, D.C., Virginia, Maryland newspaper publisher. Elijah Lovejoy published in Illinois, and his newspaper as well in Illinois was anti-slavery and very loudly anti-slavery. But just to show you the times, Elijah Lovejoy in his publications angered some in the community, so much so that twice they came to destroy his newspaper press to stop him in his abolitionist work. And then the last time they came, and he ended up murdered because of what he was writing in his newspaper. So Lovejoy is always considered a martyr for the abolitionist movement because of his death and for publishing abolitionist sentiment. Abolitionists in politics, so the parties that cultivated abolition. The Liberty Party claimed that the Constitution, that slavery was not legal under the Constitution, and that was their position, so they had a strong voice, although very few members. The Free Soil Party was anti-slavery as well, and they believed that slavery competed with wage labor, and that's why they resisted slavery. That's why they wanted to end slavery. Finally, in the 1850s, the Republican Party, as those two parties disappeared, the Republican Party would draw from all these parties that wanted to end slavery. And their position in the 1850s, and then finally Abraham Lincoln becomes the icon for the Republican Party, was that it was an economic, political, and moral evil, ultimately. And Abraham Lincoln says that. So those are all the resistance, and most of it obviously in the North, and then a more passive form of resistance in the South, which was natural to the fact that they were oppressed in the South and couldn't get out and voice their opinions. In the South, though, there was a large voice on the other side and defending what again was called the peculiar institution. In 1830, they silenced abolitionist sentiment in the Congress by the Gag resolution, which was partly a response to and fear, right, of rebellion on the part of slaves, and Nat Turner really made that evident to the South. So they wanted that Gag resolution placed on any discussion in Congress of slavery and abolition of slavery. The Gag resolution again, right, just applied to Congress. Those who argued for slavery, the pro-slavery, which was mostly the South, right, said that it was a positive good, that the races could get along together, that the society they had created was a healthy society with slavery in it. They also said that the Bible had slavery in it, so it was okay in a Christian way, and that Aristotle, even the ancient Greeks, argued that there are some people who just are slaves by their nature. They also claimed that they had saved the slaves from barbarian culture and living in Africa and had brought them and made them into Christians. So they had saved them from barbarianism and brought them into Christianity. They claimed too that families, that slavery was good for slave families, and that slaves were happy, that they had a good family structure, and that they were happy in the South. And you can see in Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, where he starts to talk about that, the whole idea that slaves were happy because they were singing. And he wants specifically to address this claim by those who were pro-slave. And he says, no, they are not singing because they're happy. They're singing because they're profoundly sad. And finally, the South claimed that blacks had better care in the South than in the North. So they said, we have slaves down here, but we take much better care of them than you will find the situation of blacks in the North, that are often relegated to slums and the worst jobs, and subject to both racism and oppression in the North. That in the South they had more security and they had more care. And if you could take everything out of this and look at the living conditions of blacks in the North and some of the slaves in the South, you could make this argument, because yes, some slaves lived on large plantations, wealthy plantation owners who kept their plantations and minimized well and treated their slaves humanely. And in the North, you could find lots of blacks who, because they couldn't get the better jobs and were working the worst jobs or had no job at all, were in dire poverty and living in comparably terrible conditions. But just so you know, material well-being doesn't seem to matter as much to people as their freedom. And so once the Civil War is over again, we would see lots of blacks choose freedom over staying with their masters. Lots. 90%. Right? And the last thing is, here I have it, the gag resolution. Right? No longer can you discuss slavery or the abolition of slavery in Congress. And that gag resolution is put on Congress in 1830. So the South refused to even discuss the issue politically by the 1830s. So now you'll go for 30 years before the Civil War starts, and the South is obviously a little bit uncomfortable being attached to a North that is free and has a strong abolitionist movement.